Hello, my favorite listener. It's Friday, and this is Rust Belt Studio, so that means it's Into the Dark of the Woods. This is episode 5 of The Birch Bride, the final episode of this arc. We have the two other shows at Rust Belt Studio. We have Mikey and the Garden Arch and The Engine of War. Both are more fantasy serials. They're 22 episodes in total. They're coming up on their mid-season. If you haven't had a chance to, you should check them out. They run on Tuesdays opposite each other, every other Tuesday, wherever you get your favorite podcast. But enough about that. We know what you came for. Settle in. The show is about to start. She had been so young. She had seemed like she'd gotten better. They buried Augustine the following morning. Marcel had gone and gotten Jacques to help him. The ground hadn't frozen yet, and this was not the deep of winter, and it took a spade without too much argument. Marcel dug while Jacques stood nearby, ready when needed and otherwise still. The birch grove was quiet, its leaves all but fallen. They placed her where she had liked to stand in the evenings, near enough to the cabin that the smoke from the stove would drift past when the wind was right. Marcel lowered her himself. He arranged her hands carefully. He smoothed her hair once, then again, correcting nothing that needed correcting. When it was done, he remained standing at the edge of the grave. She liked it here. Yes, Jacques agreed. She did. Filling in is faster than digging, and it was over before Marcel could think too long on it. They stood together until the chill began to settle, and Marcel did not cry. He did not kneel or strike the earth or speak again. When Jacques said they go inside, Marcel nodded and followed, leaving the grave unmarked for the moment. The sky began to change by evening, and Jacques decided to stay with his friend for the night. The air thickened first, the lake drawing clouds low and fast, and wind came in hard off the water, moving through the grove with a restless insistence that made the birches creak and sway. Jacques began worrying for the roof, and Marcel stood at the window and watched. Thunder followed without warning, close enough to feel in the chest, and the rain came next, heavy and immediate, striking the cabin hard enough to drown conversation. Water found its way into the ground the way it always did, seeping into places already loosened. Then the lightning struck. The sound was sharp and final, like stone breaking, and the flash lit the clearing bright as day for an instant, long enough to see the grove reassemble itself differently. Marcel was outside before Jacques could speak. Rain soaked him through in moments, and he stood in the clearing, unmoving, his face lifted toward the damage. A birch lay fallen near the grave, its trunk split open where the lightning had struck, bark torn back to reveal pale, smooth wood beneath. The earth around it was gouged and dark, rain already pooling in the wound. The tree had fallen toward Augustine. Jacques came up beside him, breathless. "You'll catch your death." Marcel did not turn, and the storm passed as quickly as it had come. The rain, buckets a moment ago, was already beginning to slow. The thunder moved on, and steam rose from the ground where heat met water, the clearing holding the sharp, clean smell that followed a hard rain. Marcel stepped closer to the fallen tree, and his hand laid against the exposed wood. The grain ran clean and even there, unbroken despite the violence that had brought it down. He stood like that for a long moment, his palm resting flat against the pale surface, as if listening to something beneath it. In the morning, Marcel emerged from his home with his tools. Jacques watched as Marcel knelt beside the tree and began to whittle. At first, the cuts were small and careful, testing. Marcel removed loose bark, trimmed away splintered edges, worked the wood the way he always had, patient, deliberate, without haste. Jacques felt a quiet relief at the familiarity of it. Men needed something to do. Hands needed work. The rain began again, lighter this time, misting rather than falling, and Marcel did not look up. He worked through it, the blade moving steadily, shavings collecting at the base of the tree, and Jacques waited. The light faded, the air cooled, but Marcel continued. Eventually, Jacques spoke. "You should go inside." Marcel nodded, but he did not stop. When he finally rose, it was only to gather his tools more securely and carry them back to the cabin. He did not look at the grave as he passed it. He did not look at Jacques. That night, the cabin stayed lit long after it should have gone dark. Jacques had left after supper and now lay awake in his own place, listening to the wind move through the grove and wondering whether that fallen tree had been standing closer to the grave than he remembered. He told himself it was only the storm rearranging things, the way storms did. Marcel returned to it at first light and began again. Marcel returned to the fallen branch every morning. At first light, when the fog hung eerie between the trees before the sun could burn it off, before the lake decided what kind of day it would be, he was there. This was no longer whittling. Marcel did not test the wood now. He did not pause to consider grain or resistance. He cut with confidence, removing material in long, decisive strokes, as if the shape were already known and his hands were merely catching up. He used chisels instead of small blades, and he shaped in earnest. Jacques brought food, and Marcel ate only when reminded. He slept in short stretches, rising again before the sky had fully turned, and when Jacques suggested rest, Marcel nodded politely, but he kept working. She would hate me wasting daylight. Jacques watched the form emerge with growing unease. What began as a broad suggestion tightened quickly into intent, and the wood fell away in purposeful arcs and the lines sharpened. The posture took shape, and Marcel circled the piece as he worked, attacking it from different angles, carving not just what was present, but what needed to be revealed. Jacques cleared shavings when they grew too thick beneath Marcel's knees, and he tried not to look too closely, but recognition was no longer avoidable. You're working fast. Marcel shook his head. I'm late. Late. That word landed wrong, and Jacques swallowed heavily. Late for what? Marcel stopped then, blade hovering just above the wood, and he considered the question seriously, as if it deserved precision. For her. I should have started sooner. He resumed cutting before Jacques could answer, and the cabin fell further into neglect. The stove would burn low, the tools lay where Marcel set them down, no longer returned to their places. The careful improvements he had once made, the better latch, the sharpened peg, they went unattended. The world beyond the birch no longer seemed to apply. All that mattered was the figure rising from the pale trunk. Marcel spoke more now, not to Jacques, but spoke to the wood, still. You're still when you're listening. Jacques remembered Augustine reading at the table and the way she held herself without tension, and felt something tighten painfully behind his ribs. The carving accelerated. Hands took shape, slender, precise, carved with reverence rather than speed, and Marcel slowed only there, his cut smaller, more exacting, as if aware that mistakes could not be undone at that scale. He would work through rain, snow, and cold. His fingers split and bled, and he wrapped them without complaint, returning to the tools as soon as the bleeding slowed. Jacques tried again. You can stop, he said gently, even if it's just for a day. Marcel shook his head. If I stop, she waits. She told me she didn't want to stop. How can I? Jacques did not know how to argue with that. The face emerged last. Marcel approached it differently than the rest, circling, studying, stepping back, then forward again. He carved more slowly there, but with an intensity that bordered on ferocity. Jacques saw him scrape away entire sections and begin again without hesitation, as if unwilling to accept anything less than recognition. When the face finally resolved, Jacques had to turn away. It was Augustine. Not as she had been at the end, not hollowed or thinned or tired. She stood as she had in the summer, whole and present, her expression calm and familiar, her gaze unfocused only because wood could not look back. It was too whole. Marcel stepped back once and nodded, satisfied, and he set his tools down carefully, arranging them with the old habit, returning briefly, as if order still mattered somewhere, and Jacques seized the moment. Marcel, come inside, eat, sleep. Marcel looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time since the storm, he said, My hands need something to do now. They don't have her to hold. Jacques felt the truth of that land heavy in his chest. The work did not end there. Marcel refined, he adjusted, he smoothed, he chased details no one else would notice. He carved until the figure felt finished to him, until nothing more could be taken away without harm. When he finally stepped back, the carving stood beneath the birches, pale against the darkening woods. Marcel did not speak, he did not touch it again. He simply sat at its base as the light faded, his back against the trunk of the fallen tree, his posture oddly peaceful for the first time in days. Jacques waited with him until the cold made waiting foolish. "I'll come back and check on you tomorrow." Marcel nodded. The next morning the tools were laid neatly at the base of the tree, but Marcel was gone. Jacques searched for Marcel for 3 days. He followed the paths Marcel had worn into the land, the line toward the lake, the narrow track through the birches, the places a man went when he needed quiet and thought he knew where quiet lived. Jacques would call his name until it felt foolish to keep doing so. He checked the shoreline, the trap lines, the cabin. Marcel never answered. On the 4th day, Jacques stopped looking for footprints and began to look for absences. The cabin sat open and empty, and the stove was cold, and careful improvements Marcel had once made, the better latch, the shaped pegs, remained. But without the man who had shaped them, they felt unfinished, like a sentence without its final word. Jacques returned to the grove. The statue had been moved to where Marcel had left it, pale against the darkening woods, on the grave Jacques had helped his friend dig. She stood resplendent in birch carving, with a dress carved in such a way as to forever sway in a non-existent wind. And that should have been enough, but what else Jacques noticed hurt all the more. She stood beneath the shelter of another birch. Tall, strong, its bark clean and pale, its leaves full, despite the season's turn. Jacques stopped a few paces short, his breath catching. He did not remember that tree being there. He tried to place it in his mind, before the burial, before the storm. But memory refused to cooperate. He had known this grove for years. He knew where things stood. He was certain of that. And what tree had its leaves this far into the year? The tree's roots ran close to the grave. Its branches cast a careful shade over both the carving and the earth beneath. Jacques did not say Marcel's name aloud. He did not need to. Understanding came to him not as certainty, but as acceptance, the quiet knowledge of a man who had seen enough of the world to stop demanding proof from it. Marcel was gone. Not lost. Gone. Jacques stood there for a while, tears coming unbidden to his cheeks. He had lost 2 friends, and while he had liked Augustine for her humor and charm, he had grown to love the man she married for all the reasons that she had. The man who had reminded him of home. The man who he had helped build a home here. A soft, caring man who had loved the land, his wife, and Jacques was convinced his friend too. He cried harder when he realized his dilemma. Jacques was no carver. His hands knew tools, they knew work, but they did not know how to free a man from the shape he had chosen. He could not carve Marcel from the tree any more than he could carve grief from his own chest. But the statue could not remain, not alone, not waiting. Jacques thought about this for a while. The birch that had been downed by the storm had not been standing dead. It was still living and very green when Marcel had been carving it. The smell of wood still hung heavy around her now. He would not move her. She was in the perfect spot beneath the other tree. He gathered the old dead pine needles first, crackles the kids called them for the sound they made burning. He built a base heavy with it so he could get a good launch to his fire. He had the kindling stacked deep on top of that, things to help aid the fire but would still burn quickly. He needed as much flame as he could muster. The good dry wood behind the cabin, the stuff that Marcel had been stacking for the winter, he used that last. His scaffolding around Augustine's carving came up just below her chest. He hastily put some stones and a ring around it just to make sure it didn't spread too far. He looked up at the new birch, assessed the leaves that were virulent green while the rest of the grove's bounty lay in rot on the ground. If the flames leapt high, they would just bounce it back down and collect the smoke. The fire took quickly. The pale birch wood burned bright and clean, and the flames lifting Augustine's likeness into motion at last. Smoke rose in long, pale ribbons curling upward through the leaves carried by the lake wind. Jacques watched until the heat forced him back. Go on, wherever he's waiting. He stayed until the fire burned down to ash. The tree remained. Jacques stood beneath it for a long time after that last ember died, the smoke thinning, the air cooling. The grove held its breath and then let it go. He left the clearing as he had found it, quiet, changed, but not broken. The cabin stayed empty. Winter came in full. The schoolhouse reopened with a new teacher, one who did not know Augustine's name except as something mentioned once, briefly in passing. The children adjusted as children always do. Names faded, lessons continued. Jacques moved on. He left Grand Marais. Years later, people spoke of the grove near what very few called the Emery place. The cabin was little more than a ruin, and the birches all clustered together, some throwing seeds for future trees. The paths were all overgrown and near impossible to even spot. They called that grove the Weeping Birches, and spoke of how one tree stood taller than the rest, its shade deeper, its bark marked faintly with lines that looked almost like tracks, like it was tear-stained. No one downed that tree, no one needed to. Some things, once someone says finished, do not require further shaping. Hello again. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of The Birch Bride. It's the final episode in this arc, and is the 20th episode of our Into the Dark of the Woods series. It was written and performed by Brian Foster. We appreciate your support. We appreciate you being a member. We're going to take 2 weeks off now before we come back. Our next arc is entitled A Place to Keep. Its actual drop date will be March 27th, 2026. You, as a patron, will get it a day early on the 26th. I can't say enough how much we appreciate you being here. I can't say enough how amazing it is that this is our 20th episode already. And I guess all that's left is, until next time, my favorite patron.